Here at the Canadian Club, we have always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas and inform the most relevant and compelling conversations of our time.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
My name is Glenn Parkinson, and I'm President-elect of Canadian Club Toronto. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the land that we're on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We're grateful for the opportunity to be able to come together and to learn on this land. Guests, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our AV supplier Van Valkenburg Communications and to LiveMeeting.ca for making it possible for us to gather virtually this afternoon. Now, lockdowns have lifted, unemployment is at record lows, and for now the economy is holding its own. But there are, of course, dark clouds: continuing inflation, rising interest rates, weather disasters, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and fears of recession on our horizon, just to name a few. In short, there's a lot of factors that are causing concern and stress. Today, in honor of Financial Literacy Month, our expert panelists will discover and discuss financial resilience and try to ease the minds of Canadians who are anxious about their financial future. We're lucky to have them all here. But before we go into today's panel, I want to review a few housekeeping instructions, more from a technical perspective. So please take note of the following. The click here to switch stream button helps you if you find that your internet is slow. So the video quality may decrease, but audio quality should remain strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can either enter questions in the window and they'll be sent to the moderator. The request help button located in the bottom right corner of the page is for technical support. Now, quick thanks to today's sponsors, Canadian Bankers Association and HomeEquity Bank, for helping to make this event possible. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit, and we've been gathering people together for 125 years. It's because of sponsors, partners, and members that we're able to do so. So thank you for your continued support. A tradition that our club maintains is the toast we make to our country. If you have a beverage close by, please join me in a toast to Canada.
To Canada.
Today's discussion will be moderated by Bruce Sellery, CEO of Credit Canada and a past president of Canadian Club Toronto. It's so great to have you back, Bruce. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Financial Literacy Month every November. For those of us who are really focused on financial literacy and financial well-being, this is kind of our World Cup. So I know there's some like soccer sports event happening over there, But here we are focused on helping people get a better handle on their money, focusing on improving those outcomes that connect so closely to the things that Canadians value so much. So our topic today is building financial resilience, how to help Canadians manage money in uncertain times. And Glenn went through some of the uncertainties that people face. There are many, and they're both similar and different depending on the circumstances that you find yourself in. We have assembled a panel that is able to bring together some of these different life experiences, these different lived experiences. And I'm going to introduce that panel now. We're going to have a conversation with the commissioner of the FCAC, and then we're going to broaden that conversation out with our panelists. But I want to introduce them first off so that we have a sense for the different perspectives, the different ideas, and the intersectionality, to use that big and important word that those assembled represent. We begin with Keith Martell, CEO of First Nations Bank of Canada. Keith, I didn't even know about First Nations Bank of Canada till a couple of years ago, and some people in this event may not have heard of it. What is the mandate of First Nations Bank of Canada?
Sure. So we were started in 1996, and our basic mandate was to give access to financial services to Indigenous Canadians. And that includes both physical and logical access. And, you talk about, where we're at today. Glenn gave a great introduction, which included the land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements is an Indigenous history, and there's a cultural aspect to it. But it's not just a physical relationship. It's a logical and a relationship. And I think what we were created to do is to create a relationship between Indigenous people and financial services, which they didn't have access to and prevented their economies from growing.
You also have such incredible perspective about what it is to be a Canadian in the North, what it is to be, your clients are Canadians or folks who live in really remote places that many of us have not had the opportunity to visit. And you have an insight into different socio and economic backgrounds. So we're going to hear from more from Keith as the conversation progresses. Next up, Scott Stirrett, CEO of Venture for Canada. Scott, Venture for Canada is a very, very fast growing nonprofit in this country. How would you describe your mandate?
The mission of Venture for Canada is to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindset of young Canadians. And we do that through recruiting, training, and supporting young Canadians to work at startups and small businesses across the country.
So how many would-be entrepreneurs or those with an entrepreneurial mindset would VFC connect with in a year?
This year, approximately 3,600 young Canadians will go through our programs from coast to coast to coast.
Wow. Okay. So you work with young Canadians. You are a young Canadian yourself. You have perspective on the entrepreneurial nature of the economy today. You are representative of the LGBT community. So many different perspectives that you provide. Yvonne Ziomecki Fisher, EVP HomeEquity Bank. Yvonne, you spend most of your time working with clients who are 55 plus or seniors or 55 or better. Tell us one thing you have learned about that particular demographic as the last year or so has unfolded.
So thank you, Bruce. So we're the leading provider of reverse mortgages in Canada, and obviously we work with Canadians 55 and older. I think one thing that we've learned is that just like everybody else, they're really struggling in the post-COVID world, and the way that they're struggling with inflation and the looming threat of recession is very different than most of us. So excited to join the panel and talk a little bit about it more later.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And you have the perspective, not only in a professional context, so engaged with the needs of those 55 plus, you also have had a real perspective as an immigrant to Canada arriving here. And so we've got all sorts of different things that we can bring into this broader conversation, but we're going to elevate it up to the level of the FCAC, the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, and to its commissioner, Judith Robertson. Hello, Judith. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Bruce. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
There is so much activity underfoot. I mean, the folks at FCAC have been curating and amplifying all sorts of Financial Literacy Month activities from coast to coast to coast. And it really is grounded in a very compelling strategy for financial literacy. And I have joked that I have very little interest, for the most part, in government strategies, with one exception, and it is this one. So Judith, we're going to bring in this graphic because it is so clear, it is so compelling, and I want to ask you to speak a bit about the focus of the financial literacy strategy and some of the highlights that you think people should take away.
Sure. So I could go on for quite a long time, but I will try to keep it brief. And thank you for this shout out, because we couldn't be more proud of this strategy, but it's very homegrown to FCAC. And in particular, I would say the infographic is also the product of one of our employees, Adele Hessian. And I just think it is a tremendous example of how you can encapsulate a 40-page strategy in one pictograph. So the key of this strategy versus previous strategies is financial literacy used to be all about raising awareness, providing information to consumers, trying to help individuals make good choices. And of course, that is still very important. But what we have put on top of that, and in the infographic, you can see it as the outer band of the rainbow. So the inner band, the green one, is consumer building blocks, we're calling that. The outer band is the ecosystem. So this is really recognizing that consumers don't exist in a vacuum. Consumers exist in an environment that includes what we call stakeholders, but it is financial service providers, banks. It is regulators like us. It is stakeholders, community groups who are working with different individuals. So it's the whole bit. And our insight, and not mine personally, but I'll shout out Dr. Supriya Syal. The insight here is that it's not sufficient to have individuals trying their best with the information they have. We need to create an environment, the ecosystem, that actually fosters their ability to make good decisions. So that's where we get to the removing barriers, access, right? Speaking in language that they understand, and in catalyzing actions. So it's pithy. There's a ton of stuff embedded in here, but we're so proud, and we're so proud that it has been embraced, not just nationally by our stakeholder group, but also internationally. And like most innovations, it seems very obvious once it's laid out, but it just wasn't there before.
Yeah, it really wasn't. And I've been in this world for 20 plus years, and it wasn't there. And I think there's a real opportunity for partnership for those of us in the ecosystem to do more to really drive these outcomes that will make life better for Canadians. The one thing that I want to start with, and it comes back to the title of this event itself, and that is financial resilience. So you saw the little sprouting tree, it was rooted. How do you define this phrase, financial resilience, and why would you argue it's at the center of everything?
Well, that's the ultimate goal, right, of financial literacy, is for individuals to have financial resilience. So, oh my gosh, unbelievable. Just bear with me one second.
That's okay. So Judith was talking about the crafting of the financial literacy strategy and the real integration of the latest thinking in behavioral science. The other element that Judith's going to talk about a little bit about is how we measure those sorts of things. So Judith, it looks like I have you back. You were going to speak to financial resilience.
Thanks for the save, Bruce.
This
This
totally
is why you get rid of your landlines, I think.
Yes.
So my great apologies for that. Yes, so financial resilience is the persevering, right? So we hear about resilience in many contexts: mental health, physical health, but also financial health. And it's a more realistic view, I think, of a person's lifespan, that there will be changes, shifts, some of them happy. You know, you have a baby, that's a financial impact, a shock that needs to be planned for and responded to. So it's really that's the resilience, is being able to persevere through these shocks. And so in addition to laying out the framework of the strategy, trying to allow stakeholders to see places where they can participate in moving this forward, we also want to use our role as the umbrella to measure what works. And so that's the measurement plan that will be introduced next week.
Wow. All of a sudden, here we are. So when you relate financial resilience to the focus of Financial Literacy Month this year in 2022, what are some of the things that you would say about how the ecosystem of which you are a part is working together to increase financial resilience?
Well, the very best thing about the stakeholder view is that there is no shortage of opportunities. So I'll call out a couple. One, if I could speak to FCAC, so what are we doing? And you know, as a regulator, one of the things, if you look on that thing way over in the end, is increasing consumer protection. Right. And so we're a regulator. We are responsible for consumer protection and financial services, principally for banks. And so one of the things that has really shifted already is the introduction of what we call the Financial Consumer Protection Framework. And so that is a replication on the regulatory side of the shift in the onus. So moving away from just the individual being in a buyer beware situation, needing to make their individual choices, and putting the onus more on the institutions. So institutions have to consider what products are appropriate for specific consumers, right? They have a responsibility there. They have to provide more information on a more timely basis. They have to respond more timely to complaints and so on. So there's the shift there towards the moving the onus away from the individual onto the institutions. That has already happened, and we will see that unfold over time.
Can you give us an example or two about what those enhanced consumer protections might look like from a consumer standpoint? Because I think, wow, if I ruled the world and I only cared about the well-being of the individual, I wasn't accountable for a P&L at a bank, I would market things like credit cards differently, because I, as the CEO of Credit Canada, see the challenges that so many Canadians have in eliminating that outstanding balance every single month. But we live in a capitalist society, and so there, of course, is a role, for more than a role. The industry is focused on driving profitability, and making credit cards accessible and having people use them is a part of the way that they do that. So could you give me an example of a consumer protection that a consumer might see?
Well, so one that I would think everybody has already seen is the alerts. Right. So that is part of the consumer protection framework. So now your bank is required to send you, or at least give you the opportunity to receive alerts when your balance in your bank account has reached a certain limit and you have a payment due. And the idea here is to try to equip people with the knowledge at the right time in a format where they can take action to avoid fees and that sort of thing. But I'll go on to say, though, that that's one small example. And the point of the measurement plan is to try to aggregate these individual examples of what might actually work. So we have a natural experiment going on to see if that actually does improve outcomes for consumers. And then the follow on would be, let's do more of what works and less of what doesn't work.
We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who have joined us for this event today. Many of them are thought leaders. Many of them are folks who have an ability to affect what their organizations do and the plans that they pursue. What would you seed on the measurement piece in particular? Counting change, I think, is what it's called, so that when it is rolled out, we'll be ready to go and we'll just eat it up immediately.
Well, so the idea is to provide both a place where good results can be shared and accessed, right? So we would provide that open access. So stakeholders don't need to find each other. They can go through us. So using our network ability, but also provide the tools that we have or we have access to that help define what measures would be useful, right? Because we want measures that we could compare. We want measures that make sense and are founded in evidence-based research. So trying to assist in the formulation of the measures for the individual stakeholders' programs.
We, as I mentioned off the top, intentionally assembled a panel that would have a view into various different demographics. We know that the pandemic did not affect all Canadians in the same way or to the same magnitude. We know there are groups that had a harder time emerging from those circumstances and will have a harder time given the economic uncertainty ahead. Youth, seniors, Indigenous communities are three of the communities that we've highlighted here. There are some examples that you would offer on things that are being done within the ecosystem in those areas. Can you talk a bit about some of those?
Sure, there are so many, and it's so exciting to me, and happy to see your panelists here because we have been involved with many of them. So I'll say that on the Indigenous community side, we have had a pilot program with the Generations Education Institute, the Martin Family Initiative, and ABC Literacy Canada. So that is an area of focus for us that we look forward to continuing. We've also partnered with a gamified learning tool, which is targeted for young adults, particularly girls and women. Again, trying to get that right information at the right time, at the right level. And we work quite often with, I think Prosper Canada is a great example in terms of their programs providing access to trustworthy advice. And I would say Credit Canada, we would highlight you there as well, that's really a critical element that all Canadians need, no matter what situation you're in from time to time. You need someplace that you can go and get good advice.
A reminder to those of you who are attending live to this event, you can send questions through the platform. There is a place on the platform. Please send those questions. They will then be sent to me and I will incorporate them into the discussion as we continue. So we're not going to do like a specific Q&A at the end. We're just going to sort of roll those questions in as we go. So if you have a question for the commissioner, please send that, or if you have other questions that unfold as our conversation unfolds, please feel free to send them. I do want to ask you, just coming back to this idea of financial resilience, we know that there are so many things that have occurred in the last, call it 12 months, that have been really challenging for people. Inflation, one, the price of cauliflower, the price of milk, the price of eggs, the price of gas, and the rising costs of interest rates. So those are, they feel temporal in this moment. Could you speak to some of the other broader things that have put a barrier for Canadians when it comes to financial resilience?
Sure. We could go on a long time.
For days we could.
I mean, it's been a challenging time for sure. So I'll just say a couple of things. One is we are actually publishing some research next week, which is on consumer vulnerabilities. And the reason I bring it up is it's quite interesting because during COVID, we did monthly surveys. So it's a very up-to-date and timely view of people, but it also is allowing us to compare to a survey we did pre-COVID. So we used to do this every 5 years. So it's a very interesting and sobering trend line. And it goes beyond, the state of the economy. It really goes to how people are reacting to it. And, one of the highlights or lowlights is, the increase in Canadians borrowing for daily daily, daily expenses, the increase in Canadians going to payday lenders or online lenders, and so on. So there really are good evidence for increased vulnerability, generally speaking, and in particular amongst more vulnerable communities. And I think one of the biggest challenges at this time is we have lived in an economic environment that was one way for so long, low interest rates, booming economy, and so on. And so a lot of the correction that is going on now with interest rates are things that people have not seen before. So it really puts the emphasis, I think, on individuals needing to inform themselves. And we have alerted our regulated entities that they have a responsibility to inform their clients on, well, what's changed and what should they expect with their mortgage rate if it's a variable rate, and so on. So that's the ecosystem and the individual working together to try to understand, oh, what does this look like now, different than when it was before.
We're going to bring our panelists into the conversation in just one moment, but I want to ask you the first question from the floor, Judith, and it really gets at the times we find ourselves in today as distinct from the times we would have been in, say, 10 years ago in terms of technology. And I'll ask the specific question, but then I'll follow with a question that I think would fit within the broader context of the FCAC. So the specific question is, what's the gamification for women as it relates to financial literacy, which I know is quite precise. Let me broaden that out to say, as the FCAC looks to the ecosystem to leverage, to engage on technology that is relevant and resonant for particular demographics. I have a 12-year-old who's pretty into TikTok. How do you think about technology and the role that it will play in improving financial resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, one of the building blocks on the little rainbow is support increased digital access and digital literacy, right? So recognizing that our financial system is moved, and COVID accelerated that move to digitization. And there's all sorts of great positives that can result in that, but there's also a real chance that people get left out or left behind. And access to the financial system is a key element to confidence in our financial system that we need to preserve. And so that's physical access, digital access, but it's also dealing with, particular issues like identification. Two-factor identification excludes anybody who doesn't happen to have two devices or even one device, right? And so, or you have a physical disability that makes a digital access more difficult. So there are so many details in there that we really are at the beginning of trying to sort out and ensuring that we don't lose something, but are taking advantage of the benefits. As far as the gamification, just to touch on that a bit, it is a huge positive if you can deliver information in a way that's timely, relevant, engaging. Bruce, you know this very well, and matches, it resonates with the person receiving it. So gamification can do that, but we also know that it can be manipulative and it can introduce negative results as well. So we have to be careful.
Some of the personal finance so-called experts on TikTok make my blood run cold. Some are amazing. Some make my blood run cold. Keith, I think this is a really important time to connect the work of First Nations Bank of Canada and your clientele in some of these remote parts of this country who may think, yeah, gamification sounds great. If I could get, on the internet for more than 5 minutes, or my download speeds were sufficient to support some of these interventions. Can you give us a sense for what the experience is like for your clients who are in the farthest parts of this country?
Yeah, and Indigenous people are quite a high percentage of north and remote, and we've got a lot of north and remote in Canada. And for the most part, the rest of us who live sort of within, a few hundred miles of the US border don't think about that north and remote and the difficulty that people there have in doing business. So, we have 10 community banking centers, which are small community-based banks in 10 communities in the north, and we have more than any other financial institution in Canada. So that just tells you how, a very small bank serves, most of the physical locations in the northern 3 territories. And so there's a lack of physical access, which is a huge issue. So, we opened a community banking center in the Nunavut community, and in that community, there's a large mining operations nearby. But the mining company could only get about 30% of their staff on direct deposit because most people didn't even have bank accounts. So you say, well, why didn't they have a bank account? Well, you had to buy an $800 plane ticket to fly to a neighboring community to open up a bank account. So that's a huge, Judith talks about the cost of doing financial service. That's a huge sort of basic fee that your first bank statement, would sort of have for you. If you don't have a need to be in that community, you had to actively go there to set up a bank account. So that's a physical, location access. And so, so what did people have to do? We had a young lady who worked at the hotel when we opened up the branch, and I was speaking to her, and, her partner, they had a child together. He lived in a different community. He mailed her the support check 1 week. It took a week for the mail to get to the community. She would open up the mail, remail that check back to her bank branch, which was another week to get there. And then, she would finally get access to the funds. So if you talk about a single mother having a 2 to 3 week delay in access to financial resources that anybody else in the country would do an e-deposit or e-transfer to, that's a significant cost of living. It's a significant detriment to getting decent financial services.
If you haven't spent time in a community that simply doesn't have easy internet access, it's almost impossible to comprehend that you would face that barrier.
Yeah, and even today, if people say, well, if you can't get physical access to a branch, why don't you just set up an electronic account, use your banking app? In a lot of these communities, they're north and remote, not just physically, they're north and remote digitally. And, you can, in many of the communities we do banking in, your bank app times out before your password clears in order to get access to your online banking. So, that's the kind of environment that some Canadians, not all, but some Canadians live in. And, going to Judith's point about dual authentication, that's an issue for many people who are of a lower socioeconomic position. They don't have multiple electronic devices they're accessing their banking on. So you may be even in downtown Winnipeg and not have the kind of access that everybody else thinks you should have.
One of the phrases, Keith, that you have said in the past that I think is really important for this conversation about financial resilience is that financial literacy is literacy. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so, it's no mystery to most Canadians these days that First Nations people have had a challenging history with education. The whole residential school history. My dad is a residential school survivor, barely got a grade 6. Education for him was a difficult issue. Thank goodness he had a different, view of education and pushed all of his kids to continue to get a higher level of education, which I've achieved, and now all 5 of my kids have achieved. But that's a change. There are still a lot of Indigenous people who have a concern about education, because education was not a positive experience for them, which leads to a lower level of literacy. And like I said, financial literacy is literacy first. If you can't read the training material that and comprehend it, that's a problem. And it's not just literacy as in, the inability to have the comprehension skills you need to read the financial literacy material. It's also putting that material in a context you can understand. So we were dealing with one of the territorial governments who had imported a really good sort of financial literacy model, and they were trying to get it distributed. And one of our branch managers from the region was trying to work with this material, and it was just unworkable because the examples were, Sally gets her allowance, walks down the street to the bank branch, opens her account. And, the kids in that region were just like, I don't understand any of this. This isn't me. You know, it's not the kids on the pictures don't look like me. The environment they talk about isn't me. The kinds of things they say I should do to be financial literate aren't anything that's accessible to me. And so that kind of logical separation between Indigenous people and North and remote or people of a poor socioeconomic condition is a barrier to financial literacy.
Scott Stirrett, CEO, Venture for Canada. We talk a lot around dining room tables, boardroom tables, about the importance for the future of the Canadian economy that it be innovative, that entrepreneurs continue to do great work and build great companies and make a difference in a for-profit or non-profit realm. What challenges would you point to when it comes to financial resilience for those with an entrepreneurial spirit?
One of the greatest challenges that entrepreneurs face in Canada is accessing financial products. It's hard to believe the level of challenges that a lot of entrepreneurs face to get a personal credit card or to get a mortgage, and the additional hoops that self-employed individuals in this country have to go through to access financial products that non-self-employed Canadians find it relatively easy to access. So I think the first place is how can we as a society and as financial institutions treat self-employed individuals more like people who are non-self-employed, and in essence, give them more equity to actually be able to access the same financial products that the majority of Canadians can access. The second,
yeah, go ahead.
The second piece is just to say a huge challenge that a lot of entrepreneurs face in Canada is the housing crisis. That in essence, if you're spending more on housing, if you're spending more or you can't afford housing, it really limits your ability to take entrepreneurial risk in this country. And there's been studies done in the UK and across the world that show that the higher the level of cost of housing, the reduced entrepreneurial activity. And it's quite intuitive in the sense that the more that you have to put into your housing, the less capital you have to invest in new entrepreneurial endeavors. And I think it's really important that Canadians consider the negative impact that the housing crisis has on our country on the future generation of entrepreneurs as well.
Yvonne Ziomecki Fisher, HomeEquity Bank, 55 plus folks, or maybe in today's day and age, maybe it's a little older. Many of them are retired. They have either made that choice or the work environment has made that choice for them, but they live on a fixed income. And tell us a bit about what you have seen for those who are retired. Those are folks who are no longer drawing a paycheck. Financial resilience means that they can't necessarily just go and take a couple of extra overtime shifts.
Absolutely. So a couple of facts to start us with. So we have more Canadians 65 and older than younger than 14. So it's a massive generation, massive cohort. And as you said, Bruce, some of them have made a decision to retire. Actually, it has increased through the pandemic. They're just choosing to leave the workforce, but some of the decision was made for them. So as they enter retirement, financial resilience is a really, is something that everybody's worried about. Inflation has made everything more expensive. So if you think about, 3 heads of lettuce are now almost $15. And we're talking about overall health. If you're not healthy physically, mentally, then it kind of seeps into other parts of your life. We're seeing people are concerned. There's only so much money to move around when you're on fixed income. So people are trying to figure out what not to, what they can go without. Some people are canceling subscriptions, getting rid of vehicles. We've seen people cancel home insurance because they think that's something they can save money on, and obviously it's not. And the business that we are in, we deal exclusively with homeowners. So we see people trying to think through the real estate realities. Should they downsize? Should they get a mortgage right now? And what are the rates? Should they get some equity out of the house through a reverse mortgage? Very complex decisions for a group 55 older, but our average client is 72 years old. So to Judith's point, clarity of communication, explaining options, it's really, really important.
Yvonne, I want to include your own personal experience as someone who was not born in Canada, who moved here and made a life here. this question, I think you'll have personal experience on. It says, as an immigrant, I'm a new Canadian, these increases in rent and housing and inflation, how do I save enough to ensure I have enough in retirement?
Oh gosh, it's a really difficult question. So I came to Canada from Poland when I was 18. I relied on government help, so I had student loans to help me get through school. I didn't have a car till I was 30 years old. So this is where, just as older Canadians have to kind of rebalance their fixed income, I worked at a bank as a teller, and I took public transport from Brampton to Toronto, for a job that paid minimum wage. But I think, you start with budgeting, you start with figuring out, what you have to work with. You get extra jobs if you can. There's a job market is really great right now. And you don't think, maybe when you're young and you're a student, you don't think, 20 years down the road, you kind of figure out what the next 3 to 5 years are going to look like, but it's not easy.
Scott, student debt is a real issue for those who have made a choice to pursue higher education and didn't come from a family that had the means to pay full board for that. How do you bring that into this conversation about financial resilience? Because I think it is hard for those of us, and I put myself in this category, 50 plus, who were kind of able to just sort of make it work. We had a job, we had a part-time job during the school year, we worked in the summer, it just kind of worked. The math isn't like that today.
Yeah, it is incredibly challenging for many. It's basically impossible for many young Canadians to be able to pay off their post-secondary tuition and living expenses purely through working kind of summer jobs, versus a generation ago that was a potential. And what we're seeing is much higher levels of student debt by young Canadians. And then I think to link it to entrepreneurial action in this country, it's important to think about how higher student debt levels impact financial resilience, which then impact entrepreneurial risk-taking. Of interest, the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia in the United States has done a study showing the impact of higher student debt levels on entrepreneurial activity, of which there's a clear correlation. In essence, the more student debt that somebody has as an individual, the less likely they are to pursue entrepreneurial activity. So it's very concerning as it relates to our work that increasingly high levels of student debt and the long-term impact that will have on the number of people who choose to become entrepreneurs in Canada.
Keith, talk a bit about the socioeconomic situation that you observe and where that remains a huge hurdle. You had another phrase that really resonated with me, and you said, if I don't have it accurate, please correct me. Poor people can sometimes make poor decisions.
Yeah, and I think poor people make poor financial decisions because they have no option. So you just look in Canada and you compare two capital cities. You compare Iqaluit, Nunavut to Toronto, Ontario, and you look at the average wage in both those regions. Iqaluit's average wage is like 36% less than Toronto, but you look at the price of bananas, it's 170 times the cost of price of bananas in Toronto. Rent's 140% the cost of the average 3-bedroom apartment as in downtown Toronto. Rice is 180%. You just look through the statistics and you sort of calculate what it costs to be a parent of 4 young children in an environment like that and rent an apartment, because there's very few people who have the capacity to own a home. And you just have a situation where when you're dealing with the day-to-day survival, planning for the future is not something you really have any concept or time to entertain. You're really about, how do I get this month's check to stretch over my ability to feed my family for a month? And so, that puts many Canadians in a position where financial planning and financial literacy is not an issue. They resort to things like payday lenders and other things that really address an immediate need when long-term planning is the solution, but you don't have the capacity to do that. And unfortunately, Indigenous people are overrepresented in that sector.
I see Judith nodding here. I'm going to come to you in just one second, Judith, for a sense of what you're hearing from this part of the conversation. But before I do that, Yvonne, I want to ask you to bring in the gender perspective, because we know there are so many differences, both in terms of confidence and in terms of systems that affect how resilient, financially resilient, women sometimes are compared to men. What would you say you've observed on that front?
So I have a very biased view because of our client base, but I see women in the older demographic generally disadvantaged, right? All gender roles, a lot of women didn't work. They were expected to look after the children and after the house. Men used to look after the money. It was something that was a taboo. Again, gender roles, women weren't kind of allowed into the crowd. But the reality is that they do live longer. So the men are dying, the women are living longer, and many of them are not prepared to deal with the estate, to deal with finances, to pay bills, to log online and pay the regular bills for the house that the husband was looking after. So I think, we all, as we get older, we're going to do a lot better than the generations before us. But this is something I see in the business. A lot of women don't have the right network of trusted advisors who can help them solve for some of those things. And also money for older generation is taboo. It's not likely that, my parents live in Poland. My mom is 75 and my dad is 79. They don't want to talk to me or my sister about money. So, and I'm very open in this space, and that's where I work. But those, the older generation, the gender stereotypes, how you don't talk about money, those things really get in the way. And then when the husband passes away and the widow has to deal with the estate and with the money situation, it can be really daunting.
We're going to move to talk about some of the solutions that we see as being able to at least make some sort of a difference in financial resilience. But before we do that, Judith, I just want to ask you, this is your life's work. You spend all of your time listening to these challenges, trying to work with the ecosystem and addressing these challenges. But in this particular part of the conversation, what have you heard? What resonated, or what would you add or punctuate that you don't think we have addressed?
So I'll just say, first, this conversation shows why the ecosystem and our focus on trying to promote stakeholder activity is the way to go. There's just way too much, and there are way too many specific issues that really need to be dealt with for there to be any one solution. The second thing I would say is we've chosen this Financial Literacy Month to focus on managing debt. So we know that managing debt is an important contributor to financial health, and in particular to financial resilience. But that's one of the big changes, is now everyone else is realizing that too. It's pretty easy to think debt is a good answer to all problems when interest rates are quite low. And so that is a real issue that we as a society will have to pay a lot more attention to going forward. Canada, as you know, is one of the highest, has one of the highest levels of household debt, and that gets in the way of not just entrepreneurs, but all sorts of other economic and personal activities as well.
Keith, as we begin to talk about some of the solutions and shine a light on ones that are currently underway, Judith mentioned work in Indigenous communities that is connected to the FCAC. I'd love it if you talked a bit more about the elements of that work and where it is today.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to offer solutions that all Canadians can buy into. And, too often, many of these issues, whether it's people without socioeconomic capacity or Indigenous people or new immigrants, we sort of say, well, it's your problem to fix, when really it's a Canadian problem to fix. And so you look at the first issue of literacy. I think the country does now appreciate the history and the legacy of residential schools and the burden we have to all bear to get over that history. But that demands us as Canadians to tell our politicians of all stripes, federal government, provincial government, local governments, school boards, and Indigenous governments, that they have to focus on outcomes. They have to get outcomes of literacy to where they need to be, or we're going to continue to have a lot of those problems. And so, whether, if you're voting for your federal government, provincial government, or you're a First Nations member, you have to demand that your government does a better job of literacy so that we can deal with these financial literacy issues. And then the socioeconomic issue, I think we as Canadians have to recognize that, the minimum ability to live in Canada is not the same everywhere. And, if we want to have sovereignty over that vast amount of land in our north, we have to make people there have the ability to live there. We can't simply say, well, it's your problem. If you live in Iqaluit, you pay 3 times as much for bananas as I do in Toronto, and you just have to grin and bear it. We have to recognize that the standard of living, the minimum standard of living for a Canadian, has to be location specific. And just moving everybody from the north to the south is not the solution. It accomplishes nothing, because you take people out of an element where they have some at least cultural and historical and physical ability to live, and you put them in a place they can't. And we also, if we don't have any people living in the north, how can we retain our sovereignty over the northern part of Canada? Other countries are filling the north in order to assert sovereignty. If we're going to do that in Canada, we have to recognize the cost of living if you're going to live there.
Yvonne, there is something called a seniors code. What is the seniors code, and what opportunity do you think that brings to this question of how do we build financial resilience?
So seniors code is something that actually came down from FCAC. Each organization that's regulated is asked to provide, context in terms of how we're dealing with older Canadians, what services are set up, what value add we're adding. So in our seniors code, we talk a lot about fraud and educating people, all the scams that are just getting more clever from day to day, but also making sure that all the materials to older Canadians are in plain language, and people can understand the products that they're buying or getting into, and all the terms and conditions. In terms of what people can do, I do think I'm thinking more kind of on the personal level. On the personal level, there's some very easy call to actions. As the holiday season is coming up, people are going to be seeing each other a lot more. Check in on your elders. Make sure, simple things. Make sure unopened mail's not piling up. Make sure little repairs that weren't done last year are taken care of, because that could be a sign of financial difficulty that your family members are having. Don't be conversations. You can't have them cold, but you can kind of schedule time. My dad is a master of this. Like, he kind of sets these things up, makes it comfortable to have conversations. And the most practical call to action or advice I can give people is go and find your power of attorney and your will, because that plays well into preparedness and making sure that you have at least the most important financial documents where people can find them or where you can find them.
Judith, I want to include your perspective on seniors and maybe the code in particular. I am now someone with aging parents. One of my parents has Parkinson's, and despite a lifetime of being 1,000% on top of every single financial decision she had, she at almost 87, my mom's not able to do that anymore. And so as much as we would love to empower the individual, it can't be about her. It really needs to be about the people around her kids, and also the institutions in which she has relationships. How does the challenge of cognitive decline layer into the role that the ecosystem needs to play for seniors?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great example because it is an example we can all relate to, either personally or very close. I certainly can personally with my parents as well. And probably getting a little closer personally myself than I'd like to admit. But it's so the reason for the seniors code was that it was from consumer advocates, basically a recognition that, look, this is a cohort that will likely have some challenges at some point. And we can identify other cohorts too, but this is one that we did. And we worked with the industry and with the CBA to create, a bit of a template for, well, what are the things you can do? Nobody wants to take away the agency of an individual precipitously, but there does need to be some inquiry. There does need to be some recognition that this is a possibility, and then an understanding about what to do if that occurs. And, that's just about being human. That's about understanding that your products need to be appropriate for the actual people that they are servicing.
Scott, bringing in your perspective as someone who is young, who works so closely with younger Canadians, what are some things that you would say could provide solutions on financial resilience?
One piece specific to entrepreneurship that I think is an interesting policy intervention for policymakers to consider is around creating rules in place for young entrepreneurs or people working in startups who have student debt. And then in essence, if somebody is a recent grad and they go launch a company and they have student debt, that there's policies in place to, for instance, potentially delay paying interest on that debt, or to potentially completely relieve that debt, recognizing that entrepreneurs contribute so much to this country. And how can we create more conditions where people can take those financial risks and they're rewarded for taking those financial risks? And the one thing I'll say about this specific policy intervention is that it's not a pie in the sky one. It's been talked about in a lot of countries. It was actually part of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. And it was something that she had as a cornerstone as part of her entrepreneurship strategy. Obviously, that didn't end up getting implemented. But I think it's something that Canadian policymakers should really consider in terms of how can they help unburden young entrepreneurs as it relates to student debt.
We are almost to the end of our time. I can't believe it. It feels like we just got started. Very briefly, in 20 seconds or less, I want to just get a call to action from each of our panelists. Scott, I will begin with you, and then I will move to Keith. What is one thing that you would place in the minds of our audience today?
The one thing I would say for people is to think about the barriers that that entrepreneurs face as it relates to financial resilience, and how can we build a society that is more welcoming to entrepreneurs and encourages more entrepreneurship.
Okay, Keith, and then on to Yvonne. Keith first.
Yeah, I think Canadians just have to recognize that we're not all the same, and the context in which we're the place we're at in regard to financial literacy is not all the same. So the solutions are different. And we need to recognize that financial literacy for everyone is in everyone's best interest. It creates an economy where people are more self-sufficient and less likely to be, scammed, overpaying, all the other things that the lack of financial literacy results in. So I think it's all our issues, and we got to look into all parts of the Canadian context in order to find solutions.
Yvonne, your call to action.
I think I kind of spoiled it and said it before. Check in on your elders this holiday season, not just socially, but make sure that they are healthy and think about financial resilience.
Have those conversations. Judith, I pass it to you for the last word. We have assembled a pretty extraordinary virtual audience for our event on financial resilience today. We do what we're told. So you, as the commissioner of the FCAC, I say that tongue in cheek, what would you ask of us as representatives of the ecosystem that will be so critical in making a measurable and sustained difference to financial resilience in this country?
First, I just want to thank you for hosting this event and bringing both the great panelists, but also the audience to this really important topic. Every single day, I wish I had a magic wand, Bruce, but I don't. But what I would ask everyone to do is to have a little reflection about where you fit in the ecosystem, because we're all there, even as individuals or as part of an organization or a stakeholder advocacy, we are all there. And there is something that everyone can do. And it is a collective responsibility so that we can achieve the outcome we're looking for, which is more accessible, more inclusive, and more effective financial system for all Canadians.
Judith, thank you so much. Judith, Scott, Yvonne, Keith, thank you for your insight. Thank you for your passion, and thank you for participating in our event today. Glenn, I pass it back to you.
Thank you, Bruce, and I'll echo that. Thank you, Keith, Judith, Scott, and Yvonne for taking the time to share your experience with our members and guests across the country this afternoon. In particular, I appreciated the how you took the macro topic and brought it down to the specific level of individual Canadians and the challenges they face, but then how we as family members, communities, and fellow citizens can participate in the ecosystem for the better. So thank you again. Bruce, thank you for your expert guidance as always. We've missed you at the club and look forward to seeing you even more. The Canadian Club's vision is to be the podium of choice for relevant and provocative conversations, connecting the business community and promoting inclusive and prosperous Canada. We aim to achieve this vision at every event, and today was no exception, so thank you for being a part of it. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today. Please stay healthy and stay safe.